How would you diagnose the state of journalism either in the US and the UK or even just in the US currently compared to what it was?
I don't know the UK journalism scene, obviously, as well as I know the US, and it's changed dramatically since when I began working as a journalist in the early 1980s covering the war in El Salvador. There, papers like the New York Times, where I worked for 15 years, sought to reach a broad audience. That's changed. Now, the press caters to a particular demographic. In the case of the New York Times, that would be voters, supporters of the Democratic Party. And by catering to that demographic, they feed that demographic what it wants to hear. So for 2 years, although there was nothing there, the New York Times promoted the Russiagate story that somehow Russia had intervened in our elections and was responsible for Trump's presidency, and that Trump had ties, et cetera, with Russian intelligence, all of which turned out to be untrue. They did a horrible podcast called The Caliphate, and I spent 7 years in the Middle East. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. So listening to that for about 15 minutes, I realized it was a complete hoax, which eventually was proved to be based on a figure who had never been in Al-Qaeda. It was had a kind of almost audio snuff porn quality to it, nailing, crucifying people. I mean, stuff that just didn't make any sense. And that reporter still works there because the problem with catering to a demographic is that if you feed that demographic what it wants, there's no cost for being inaccurate. And the flip side of that is that at the same time they're catering to that demographic, and the Times has gone digital, and they knew from surveys that their digital subscribers subscribed largely because of their hatred of Trump. At the same time, they're demonizing, and the right does it as well, they're demonizing the opposing demographic. So that's the new model of journalism, and there have always been problems with the legacy media, which I come out of. That's another issue. But now it's a whole new paradigm where they've really unmoored themselves from verifiable fact, and there are no consequences for it. Because they're catering to the emotional needs of their viewers or their readers rather than doing news. And I would go in terms of the airwaves, there isn't any. It's all a species of entertainment, whether that's CNN or MSNBC or anywhere else. So the state of the media has become, virtually bankrupt. I don't own a TV, I don't watch it. But even the Times is a diminished relic of what it was, with all of the attendant problems that it had when I worked there. So the media landscape is deeply impoverished, and then that added to that problem is the collapse of local news organizations, especially regional newspapers. So you no longer have reporters following the courts, following police in the city hall. All of those centers of power have gone dark, which has contributed to unchecked abuse. I mean, in the United States, police are killing, on average, using lethal force to kill about one person a day, about 1,000 people a year. And there's no check on it. So we've entered a kind of whole new era where the collapse of the press, and that is largely because of commercial interests. In the newsprint, when I started working in the Times, it made 23% a year profit because it was still a vehicle by which sellers connected with buyers. Now you don't need it. I mean, in fact, with algorithms, they all have our profiles, so they know what we want to buy, and it pops up on our computer screen. And that has just gutted the press. That, of course, along with, people forget, classified advertising used to be 40% of a newspaper's revenue, and nobody uses that anymore. So we haven't found a new model yet that will work. We don't have a system like the BBC where taxpayers pay, I don't know how much you pay a year, £100 or something. We don't have that system. Public television and public radio is essentially dependent on corporate money, and so they're not going to anger their corporate donors. So the state of the press in the United States is dire, extreme, and dangerous.